In the 1970s, British cinema was steeped in a toxic cocktail of boundless ambition and total permissiveness, a world where the shortest route to an Oscar often led through the bedroom. We have gathered 10 stories of women who did not merely cross the line of propriety, but burned it to the ground, changing lovers as easily as gloves before the eyes of a stunned and outraged nation. This is a chronicle of their triumphs and their downfalls, a story polite Mayfair society preferred to keep silent about for decades. To see the full truth without censorship, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit like on this investigation. And be sure to leave a comment. Which of these women, in your opinion, went too far in her experiments? Elizabeth Taylor. If there was ever a woman who turned her private life into the most expensive and scandalous blockbuster in human history, it was Elizabeth Taylor. By the early 70s, Liz was no longer the fragile girl from National Velvet. She was the reigning monarch of the global film industry, her British temperament fused with Hollywood ferocity into a volatile force capable of incinerating any man who strayed into the radius of her violet eyes. Taylor did not simply change husbands and lovers, she consumed them, demanding absolute devotion, mountains of diamonds, and a willingness to run with her in an endless marathon of passion and alcohol. The 1970s bound her life inseparably to Richard Burton, and their union resembled a prolonged war more than a marriage. These were the years when newspaper headlines could not keep pace with their divorces and remarriages, and the amount of whiskey they drank could have filled a small swimming pool. Taylor possessed a rare talent. She could be profoundly unhappy and dazzlingly vulgar at the same time, yet remain the most desired woman on the planet. For her, there was no such thing as too much, whether carrots on a ring, shots on the table, or men willing to abandon families and careers for a single glance from her. She lived with the certainty that the world belonged to her by right of birth, and the men in it were merely stage props, replaced the moment they began to fade, or worse, tried to impose their will on her. The 70s became a time of great transition for Liz. Her beauty took on a mature, almost intimidating power, and her appetites only grew. Her relationship with Burton was the quintessence of her excess in the highest, most aristocratic sense of the word. They made no effort to hide their affairs, their fights, and their unrestrained hedonism. When they finally parted for good in the middle of the decade, Liz wasted no time on mourning. She changed partners at a pace that horrified conservative audiences. Her bedroom became a place where destinies were decided and unspoken pacts were sealed. Taylor always chose the best, the most talented, the wealthiest, or the most powerful. Her brief but explosive affair with Iranian ambassador Ardashir Zadi became the stuff of legend. She bathed in a level of luxury no monarch could afford and behaved as if she ruled Iran itself. Yet even Eastern gold could not hold her for long. Liz craved intensity, sought constant proof of her power over male nature. She could fall in love in an instant and cool just as quickly if a man ceased to challenge her. Her next official marriage, to Senator John Warner, was an attempt to try on the role of a politician's wife, but the predator in her prevailed. Life in Washington was far too cramped for a woman accustomed to paparazzi flashes and the clink of glasses at 5 in the morning. Taylor's excess in the 70s was no cheap affair. It was a political manifesto of freedom. She openly demonstrated that a woman of her magnitude could afford anything. She changed lovers like gloves, because each new affair gave her the surge of energy needed to sustain the legend. Men lost their minds over her whims, gifting estates and jewels now worth fortunes, while she accepted these offerings with regal indifference, already eyeing the next contender for her hand and heart. Her private life resembled a boiling cauldron where passion, jealousy, and an endless hunger for possession churned together.
Colleagues on set recalled that working with her was nearly impossible. She might arrive half a day late after lingering with a new favorite, or demand a script rewrite to suit her current mood. Taylor in the 70s was a natural disaster, draped in silk and fur. She recognized no authority but her own ego. She was called wanton, labeled a man-eater, yet behind the whispers there was always admiration for her courage to be herself. She did not play at modesty. She was a queen who knew that kings come and go, while she remains eternal. By the end of the decade, Liz Taylor stood burdened with scandals and crowned the most talked-about woman in the world. Her life became a textbook on how to violate every existing taboo and still retain the status of an icon. She proved that British restraint is a myth when true passion is at stake. The men in her life were merely chapters in an endless novel written in blood and champagne. She never apologized for her choices and never looked back. For her, each new lover was another chance to feel alive, and every divorce merely an excuse to buy a new diamond. Elizabeth Taylor in the 1970s became a symbol of a woman who could own her destiny and her body without glancing at the moralists. She was the first to show that excess is not a fall, but a form of triumph, if you have the strength of character to carry it with your head held high. Her path was strewn with the broken hearts of the world's most enviable suitors, and she walked it without missing a step, leaving behind the story of a woman who was too vast for a single love and too honest to pretend loyalty to anyone who no longer inspired her.
Joan Collins. If Elizabeth Taylor was a queen resting on the laurels of her greatness, then Joan Collins in the 1970s was a hungry tigress stalking the concrete jungle of show business. Long before the world came to know her as Alexis Colby from Dynasty, Joan had already earned a reputation as a woman whose promiscuity bordered on flawless calculation. She embodied British audacity wrapped in Hollywood gloss, and her personal life during that decade resembled a high-speed highway with no stop signs in sight. Collins never hid the fact that men were a resource to her, a source of pleasure, or a lever to pull herself higher. In the 70s, her big-screen career began to lose traction, but instead of fading into the background, Joan doubled down on her explosive sexuality and scandalous image. She changed lovers as effortlessly as seasonal accessories, and each new affair landed like a slap in the face of public morality. Collins was too free for her time. She never waited to be chosen. She chose herself, and everyone fell into her net, from global stars to young boys just beginning their climb. For Joan, there were no forbidden subjects or moral limits. She openly declared that a woman had the right to as many partners as a man, and she proved it every single day. The 70s became Joan's era of soft erotica and hard ambition. After a lull, she returned triumphantly to the screen in films based on novels by her sister Jackie Collins, The Stud and the Bitch. The very titles captured her way of life with ruthless precision. She played women who used men as disposable tools, and off-screen Joan behaved no differently. Her list of conquests included Warren Beatty, Ryan O'Neal, and a parade of young playboys whose names evaporated by morning. Collins possessed a predatory charm. She knew how to make a man feel like the center of the universe, only to toss him overboard the moment he grew dull or demanding. Her marriage to Anthony Newley and the relationships that followed were nothing more than brief pauses in her endless pursuit of sensation. She did not fear condemnation, she fed on it. When the press branded her amoral, she slipped into the deepest neckline she owned and headed to yet another party in Saint-Tropez to find her next prey. Joan Collins understood that in an industry ruled by men, the only power truly available to a woman was power in bed, and she mastered that weapon to perfection.
Joan's promiscuity in the 70s was a form of survival. She watched her peers turn into former stars, relegated to playing mothers and grandmothers, and she swore it would never happen to her. She invested in her appearance and her reputation as a fatal woman, as if her life depended on it. Her affairs were not casual flings, but strategic alliances. She could romance a producer to secure a role, then a week later set the dance floor on fire with a young actor simply to feel desired and alive. Collins was brutally honest in her cynicism. She was not looking for the one. She was looking for adrenaline, power, and constant proof of her own irresistibility. Men in her life were often nothing more than props in her personal triumph. She could shatter someone else's marriage with a single arch of her eyebrow and never remember the betrayed wife's name. She was called dangerous, she was called immoral, yet deep down every woman in Britain at the time envied her ability to take everything she wanted from life without bowing to polite rules. Joan was the first to turn the image of the bad girl into a multi-million-dollar brand, and she had no intention of apologizing for her appetite for life. By the end of the decade, Joan Collins stood as a woman who had beaten both time and public opinion. She proved that one could change lovers like gloves and still remain a style icon and an object of devotion. Her life in the 70s was a rehearsal for her defining role, because Alexis from Dynasty was Joan herself, only adorned with pricier jewels and more elaborate schemes. She demonstrated that promiscuity was not a weakness, but the highest expression of strength, provided you kept control of the game. Collins passed through the decade, leaving behind a trail of broken hearts and drained wallets belonging to the world's most desirable bachelors. She was a true predator who understood that victory belongs to those unafraid of their own desires. Joan Collins entered history as a woman who never asked permission to be happy, and whose list of men served only to prove that she was too large for any of them. She was, and remains, the ultimate bitch of British cinema, a title she wears with the pride of a queen who built her empire on the ruins of male ego.
Charlotte Rampling. If Elizabeth Taylor embodied passionate Hollywood and Joan Collins represented the predatory grip of show business, then Charlotte Rampling became the symbol of a new, unsettling and irresistible freedom that entered British cinema in the 1970s. With her icy gaze from The Night Porter and her aristocratic cheekbones, she was the complete opposite of the conventional screen diva, yet it was her sexual freedom that became the most discussed subject in the elite drawing rooms of London and Paris. In the 70s, Rampling did not merely change lovers, she dismantled the very foundations of marriage and morality, doing so with such composure that it seemed no more consequential than choosing a dessert after dinner. She became an icon of intellectual provocation, a woman who openly declared to the world that one man was not enough for her. Her personal life during this decade turned into a bold and dangerous experiment, the pinnacle of which was her famous ménage à trois. While other actresses hid their affairs behind the closed doors of hotels, Charlotte openly lived in her London home with two men at the same time, her legal husband, agent Brian Southcombe, and his friend, model Randall Lawrence. This was neither a fleeting episode nor a careless fling. It was a conscious stance taken by a woman who despised convention and believed that love should have no boundaries, and that jealousy was the refuge of the weak. This three-way union sent shockwaves through conservative Britain. The press choked with outrage, branding Charlotte the most immoral woman of her generation. But Charlotte found it amusing. She appeared in public accompanied by both men, radiating absolute calm and even a trace of boredom toward the public reaction. Her excess was not vulgar, but existential. She searched for depth in the darkest corners of human nature, something reflected in her roles, particularly in the scandalous film The Night Porter.
In the 70s, Charlotte became a muse to the most radical directors and photographers, including Helmut Newton, who captured her nude in poses that bordered on pornography, yet were presented as high art. She was a woman without skin, free of prejudice and fear of judgment. Lovers came and went, leaving their marks on her biography, but Charlotte remained faithful only to herself and her hunger to explore the forbidden. She conducted affairs with co-stars, artists, and intellectuals, and each time it was more than physical intimacy. It was an intellectual duel from which she invariably emerged victorious. The 70s were a period of absolute sexual autonomy for Rampling. When her experiment with living as a trio finally came to an end, she did not rush to seek comfort in a traditional marriage. On the contrary, her appetite for new sensations only sharpened. Her affair with composer Jean-Michel Jarre became another chapter in this endless marathon of passion, where once again she set the rules. Rampling possessed a frightening honesty. She did not hide her infidelities and never searched for excuses. She believed life was too short to spend it on a single person or a single emotion. Her sexual freedom was a form of protest against the gray morality of post-war Britain, an attempt to prove that a woman could be an intellectual, an object of desire, and a completely independent player in the arena of love. She was cold fire, capable of warming, but more often burning those who tried to tame her or lock her within the boundaries of propriety. Men who entered her orbit were often morally crushed by the force of her spirit and her refusal to submit to traditional female roles. Charlotte Rampling in the 70s became a living embodiment of Freud and de Sade transplanted onto British soil, cool, calculated, and irresistibly alluring in her transgression. By the end of the decade, Charlotte stood as a woman of mystery, her trail of scandals only enhancing her status as an actress. She proved that it was possible to live the most uninhibited life without losing dignity or elite status. Her life as a trio, her explicit photo sessions, and her contempt for social norms made her the foremost rebel of the British screen. She did not simply change men, she changed the very idea of what was permissible for a woman. Charlotte Rampling entered history as a great actress who dared to turn her own biography into a provocation, and whose gaze from the 70s still feels like a challenge today. She was and remains a woman who understood that true freedom begins where propriety ends, and that in love, as in art, there is no room for compromise. Her path through that decade was paved not with flowers, but the shards of old ideals, and she walked it with her head held high, leaving behind the image of a woman too complex for one heart and too free for the entire world.
Jacqueline Bisset. If Elizabeth Taylor collected wedding rings and Charlotte Rampling collected complex mental bonds, then Jacqueline Bisset in the 1970s became the symbol of a pure, wild, and utterly independent feminine force. That decade officially crowned her the most beautiful woman in the world after the release of The Deep, where her scene in a wet t-shirt permanently reshaped the language of eroticism in cinema. While millions of men around the globe drooled over her posters, Jacqueline herself played by rules of her own, rules that horrified conservative Britain and prim Hollywood alike. Her promiscuity was of a special kind. It was honest. Bisset categorically rejected marriage, viewing it as a cage for her untamable British spirit, and changed lovers with the grace of a panther choosing the strongest male in the pride. She did not seek protection or money, she had both. She sought only passion, and the moment the fire began to fade, Jacqueline showed her partner the door without a flicker of regret. Her list of conquests in the 70s resembled an encyclopedia of the era's most desirable men, refined intellectuals and brutal athletes, ballet geniuses and screen idols. She lived with the certainty that her body was a temple, open only to those worthy of entering it at that precise moment and not a second longer. Her personal life in the 70s felt like a boiling ocean where one wave of passion instantly gave way to the next. Jacqueline possessed a rare ability to maintain aristocratic dignity while standing at the center of the dirtiest gossip. Her long-term relationship with Canadian actor Michael Sarrazin served merely as a backdrop against which her many intense affairs unfolded. She saw nothing improper in falling into bed with a co-star or the most handsome man at a society reception. For Bisset, the concept of fidelity in its traditional, tedious sense simply did not exist. She was faithful only to her desires. When her relationship with Sarrazin finally collapsed because of her refusal to bind herself by marriage, Jacqueline did not shed tears. Instead, she plunged headfirst into an affair with the great Alexander Godunov, a Soviet defector and a god of ballet. It was a union of two elements, where sex and art were twisted into a single tight knot. Godunov was younger, more beautiful, and wilder than any man before him, yet even he failed to tame this British Amazon. Bisset changed favorites not out of frivolity, but out of insatiable hunger for life. She wanted to taste everything, and men were for her merely different varieties of fine wine, each with its own flavor, but none worth drinking for the rest of one's life. Jacqueline's promiscuity in the 70s became a manifesto of a new femininity. She proved that one could be breathtakingly feminine, soft, and desirable while possessing a core of steel and absolute autonomy. The press tried to brand her a black widow or a heart-eater, but Bisset only laughed in the journalists' faces. She never played the victim and never apologized for the number of men in her bed. Her affairs were bright, brief, and devastating for her partners, who often could not accept that such a woman did not belong to them. She could take up with a famous producer for the sake of a project and a week later be in the arms of a young stuntman simply because he liked the way he smelled. In the 70s, Bisset was everywhere, on the covers of Time and Vogue, at Cannes festivals, and in the chronicles of the most scandalous parties. She lived at full throttle, turning each day into an act of provocation. Her freedom was so defiant that even the most hardened London libertines sometimes looked away. Jacqueline was the first great beauty to openly declare, "I don't need a husband, I need experiences," and she followed that rule without compromise. By the end of the decade, Jacqueline Bisset stood as a legend whose private life fascinated the public more than her roles. She proved that beauty is not a curse, but an instrument of power, if one knows how to wield it without regard for morality. Her roster of lovers, which included both the legendary Marcello Mastroianni and Terence Stamp, became her true golden globe. She passed through the 70s without losing a gram of her charm, leaving behind hundreds of broken male destinies and the image of a perfect predator who always takes what she wants. Jacqueline Bisset remained in the memory of her contemporaries as a woman who turned promiscuity into an elegant way of life and whose rejection of family bonds became one of the loudest statements of the era. She was and remains that very solitary huntress who knew the price of her independence and was willing to pay it each time she traded another lover for a new measure of freedom. Britt Ekland. If the previous heroines of our chronicles sought power or intellectual challenge in men, then in the 1970s Britt Ekland became a living trophy, fought over by the most debauched and talented rogues of the musical Olympus. This Swedish siren, who became flesh and blood of British high society, possessed the face of an angel and the appetites of a she-devil. After her marriage to Peter Sellers collapsed into ashes of jealousy and psychosis, Britt broke free of every restraint. The 70s became a period of total immersion in a world where sex, drugs, and rock and roll were the only religion. She did not simply change lovers, she collected the icons of a generation, tearing through their lives like a hurricane and leaving behind emptied wallets and shattered hearts.
Brit was the embodiment of a kind of excess that knew neither boundaries nor shame. She openly reveled in her desirability, fully aware that in a world of long hair and leather trousers, her body was the most coveted backstage pass to history itself. Her list of conquests in that decade read like the lineup of a major rock festival, from the honeyed voice of Rod Stewart to the dark genius of Lou Reed. She lived on a knife's edge, turning every affair into a media explosion that only fueled fascination with her persona, while she expertly manipulated the fragile egos of the most temperamental stars on the planet. The loudest and most destructive chord in her 70s biography was her affair with Rod Stewart. It was a union Britain watched with its mouth open. Brit was not merely a rocker's girlfriend, she was his shadow, his stylist, his drinking companion, and his greatest weakness. Their relationship was soaked in excess, endless parties, rivers of champagne, and complete freedom from moral obligation. Eklund changed partners even within this inner circle, feeling no need to remain faithful to anyone but her own pleasure. She possessed a rare talent for driving men mad with desire and then demonstrating her absolute independence, pushing them to the brink. When Rod Stewart, a man before whom millions of women lay at his feet, realized that Brit had no intention of belonging to him alone, it marked the beginning of the end of their epic affair. But Brit was incapable of prolonged sorrow. Her bedroom was always open to new contenders. She carried on an affair with Lord Lichfield, so in chaos within the ranks of the British aristocracy, then effortlessly shifted her attention to rock rebels, proving that social barriers meant nothing to her if a man was handsome enough or famous enough. Her excess was provocative, almost political. She was a woman who took everything from men and gave nothing in return, except the fleeting sparkle of her eyes. For Brit Eklund, the 70s were the decade when the line between actress and professional it-girl was completely erased. Her film roles, even cult ones like The Wicker Man or The Man with the Golden Gun, were little more than a backdrop to her turbulent private life. Producers knew that hiring Brit meant not only a beautiful face, but a guaranteed trail of scandal that would sell tickets. She was the queen of the paparazzi, always in the center of attention, always in the company of a new favorite. She was dismissed as frivolous, branded a groupie of the highest order, but Brit only laughed, continuing to change lovers like gloves. She saw it as a form of art, the art of living in the moment, without regard for tomorrow. Her body was her capital, and she invested it in the most powerful men of the era with the cold calculation of a seasoned broker. Yet beneath this cynicism lay a hunger for validation, something she could obtain only through the admiration in the eyes of another great man. She was a muse who fed on the energy of her lovers, leaving them drained while she herself bloomed beneath camera flashes at yet another reception at Studio 54. By the end of the decade, Brit Eklund emerged as a woman who had seen everything and tasted every one. She became a symbol of a sexual revolution that had gone too far. Her list of men turned into legend, and her reputation as the most promiscuous blonde in Europe was earned and unshakable. She proved that one could pass through the fire and brass pipes of rock and roll backstage life and still retain the status of an international star and a desirable bride. Her life in the 70s resembled an endless fireworks display, dazzling everyone around her and masking the emptiness that inevitably follows the celebration. Brit remained in history as a woman unafraid of her desires, who turned the changing of partners into a thrilling spectacle for an entire nation. She was the golden muse of a mad era, and her path through that decade was marked not by Film Academy Awards, but by songs written in her honor by the world's greatest musicians and by hearts she broke as easily as she opened a new bottle of vintage wine. She was and remains the great temptress, a woman who understood that in a world ruled by men, the one who wins is the one who leaves first, leaving behind nothing but the sweet aftertaste of sin and the lingering scent of expensive perfume in an empty bedroom.
Sarah Miles. If Britt Ekland collected rock stars for glamour and fame, then Sarah Miles in the 1970s turned her private life into a laboratory for exploring the darkest and most hidden human instincts. This fragile woman with doe-like eyes and a soul of a provocateur was perhaps the strangest and most unpredictable actress Britain had ever produced. For her, promiscuity was not a matter of status, it was a way of being. Sarah genuinely believed that to portray passion truthfully on screen, she had to live it in real life, preferably with her co-star. Her acting method consisted of changing lovers on every film set, turning the work process into an uncontrolled eruption of emotions. In the 70s, her name became synonymous with eccentric madness. Miles could openly confess love to several men at once, experiment with dubious wellness practices, and draw those around her into intimate games that sometimes ended in catastrophe. She was too free even for swinging London, because her freedom lacked brakes and any instinct for self-preservation. For Sarah, there were no forbidden fruits. She took a bite of everyone who crossed her path, whether it was a great director, a fellow actor, or a random traveler who assumed that behind her delicate appearance hid an ordinary woman. The peak of her excess and eccentricity came during the filming of The Man Who Loved Dancing Cats in 1973, which spiraled into a massive scandal and death. Faithful to her principle of total immersion, Miles embarked on a passionate affair with her co-star Burt Reynolds. But there was a third presence in this story, her personal assistant and former lover, David Whiting, who was painfully obsessed with the actress. One night in a hotel room, a drama worthy of ancient tragedy unfolded. After discovering Sarah in Reynolds' room, Whiting lost control. The next morning, he was found dead in Sarah's room. The press tore the actress apart, accusing her reckless relationships and hunger for experimentation of leading to a man's death. But Sarah could not be broken. Even under investigation and public condemnation, she behaved like the queen of provocation, openly insisting that her private life belonged to her alone. She changed men not for gain, but for an emotional high without which her world felt dull and colorless. Her marriage to the great screenwriter Robert Bolt was little more than an official facade behind which stretched an endless marathon of infidelities that Sarah never tried to hide, believing honesty mattered more than fidelity. For Sarah Miles, the 70s were a decade of absolute contempt for social morality. She could appear in public wearing outfits that left nothing to the imagination, or casually recount intimate details of her affairs to journalists as if discussing the weather. Her promiscuity carried an almost mystical dimension. She viewed intimacy as an exchange of energies essential to creativity and saw no reason to limit herself to one partner. Her lovers included the era's brightest intellectuals and rebels who fell under her spell and often emerged with broken hearts, unable to compete with her next obsession. Miles was an actress who never told her desires no. She was capable of vanishing to the ends of the earth for a new fascination, abandoning everything and returning just as quickly once the fire burned out. She was called mad, she was called dangerous, but in 1970s Britain she was one of the few who truly lived without caring what neighbors or newspaper critics might say. She became a symbol of that perilous freedom which does not build but burns everything around it for the sake of a single blinding flare.
By the end of the decade, Sarah Miles had become a living legend, whose eccentricities were discussed more often than her remarkable performances. She proved that one could be utterly dissolute and still retain an unearthly, almost elfin charm. Her life in the 70s was a succession of stormy affairs, mystical quests, and scandals that forever etched her name into the history of Britain's most scandalous stars. Sarah did not merely change men, she used them as fuel for an inner fire that burned too brightly not to scorch. She remains remembered as a woman who dared to turn her own biography into an endless performance, where the only rule was the absence of rules. Miles was and remains the most eccentric predator of British cinema, fully aware that the right to live as one pleases comes at the cost of loneliness and the reputation of being mad, a price she was willing to pay again and again rather than dissolve into a gray, predictable crowd. Her path through that decade was marked not only by triumphs on screen, but by a lingering trail of secrets and silences that make her figure even more compelling to those who seek genuine, unfiltered passion in film history.
Jane Birkin. If Sarah Miles embodied dangerous madness, then in the 1970s, Jane Birkin became a living manifesto of bohemian liberation, a world where the line between art, sex, and public confession was erased completely. This fragile Englishwoman with perpetually tousled hair and the gaze of a startled doe somehow rose to become the ultimate icon of French decadence, all while preserving a distinctly British charm that made her excess even more provocative. In the 70s, Birkin did not merely change lovers, she lived at the epicenter of the sexual revolution, where every breath and every movement was captured by cameras and microphones. Her union with Serge Gainsbourg was not simply a marriage, it was a decade-long performance soaked in alcohol, cigarette smoke, and an explicit eroticism that shocked even a battle-hardened Europe. The song Je t'aime moi non plus, in which the entire world heard her simulated, or perhaps very real, orgasms, became a generational anthem, and Jane herself a symbol of a woman unafraid to put her intimacy on public display. Yet behind the facade of the genius's muse stood a woman with an insatiable appetite for life and for men, who used her fragility as the perfect disguise for her boldest experiments. In the 70s, Birkin was everywhere, on the pages of scandal columns, in the arms of intellectuals, and in the beds of aristocrats, proving that good girls from London suburbs could play the dirtiest games far better than professional courtesans. Jane's excess during this decade took the form of an aesthetic rebellion. She famously refused to wear underwear, favoring sheer dresses and tiny shorts that made men turn their heads and moralists cross themselves. Her private life resembled an open book, edited by Jane herself in real time. Although Gainsbourg was her official master and creative demiurge, Birkin never truly belonged to him. Her British nature demanded change, and she sought it in the arms of those who could offer her a different shade of passion. She changed lovers not out of greed, but out of a hunger for authenticity, throwing herself into new relationships with the same childlike spontaneity with which she posed nude for glossy magazines. Her affairs on film sets were an open secret. She could fall in love with her co-stars while Serge waited for her at home with a bottle of red wine, and then return to him to slip once more into his mad, intoxicating world. Birkin possessed a rare gift. She managed to remain a holy sinner, forgiven for everything: her infidelities, her demonstrative nudity, her refusal to submit to any rules at all. She embodied a freedom that required no explanations, a freedom whose excess looked as natural as morning dew on grass, even when that dew smelled of last night's hangover and someone else's perfume. The 70s marked Jane's transformation from Gainsbourg's appendage into an independent predator of the bohemian world.
She learned to use her fame and her sexuality as a currency that opened the doors to the most exclusive clubs and the most private bedrooms of Paris and London. Her list of men during that decade included not only screen stars, but artists, directors, and even politicians, all of whom lost their heads over her blend of childlike innocence and experienced depravity. Birkin was an it girl long before the term existed, setting trends not only in accessories, but in entire ways of living. She proved that a woman could be a muse to one man and the lover of 10 others without losing herself. Her excess was light, almost weightless, free of Sarah Miles's heavy drama or Joan Collins's cold calculation. She simply lived as she breathed, changing men as easily as she swapped her famous wicker baskets for leather accessories. To Britain, she remained our Jane, who went to Paris to show the French what real freedom looked like. To France, she was an English dessert with a bitter aftertaste of scandal. By the end of the decade, Jane Birkin emerged as a woman who had completely rewritten the rules of female behavior. She proved that sincerity could be the most powerful form of provocation, and that excess was merely a way of finding oneself in a world shaped by men. Her breakup with Gainsbourg at the end of the 70s and her immediate move into a relationship with director Jacques Doillon became the final chord of her turbulent decade, confirming that she would never be anyone's trophy. Jane entered history as a woman who turned her life into an endless novel, each chapter filled with whispered passion and the crash of shattered stereotypes. She was and remains the quintessential English rose in the garden of European decadence, whose beauty and freedom became a standard for millions. Her path through the 70s was marked not only by iconic songs and films, but an endless trail of broken male hearts, none of which ever managed to unravel the mystery of this fragile woman who changed lovers like gloves while remaining the only one and only Jane Birkin.
Susanna York. If Jane Birkin was an open book of bohemian liberation, then Susanna York in the 1970s was a far more complex and dangerous riddle of British cinema. With her angelic face, enormous blue eyes, and a halo of golden hair, she appeared to be the perfect embodiment of the English rose, pure, fragile, and untouchable. Yet those who encountered her behind the scenes of film sets or in the private clubs of Mayfair knew the truth. Susanna was one of the most liberated and unpredictable predators of her generation. Her promiscuity was intellectual and covert in nature, which made her intrigues all the more devastating for the men drawn into her orbit. In the 70s, York mastered the art of contrast, playing her immaculate public image against a turbulent, almost manic private life. She did not simply change lovers, she collected them as trophies, selecting partners so that each new affair became either a provocation to society or a deliberate assault on her own marriage. Her long union with Michael Wells was little more than stage scenery behind which Susanna constructed an intricate geometry of affairs, secret meetings, and dangerous liaisons that would have destroyed the career of any other actress. But Susanna possessed a rare gift. She always emerged unscathed, leaving behind only confusion and the wreckage of male hopes. The 70s became a decade of absolute experimentation with her own sensuality. She was among the first British actresses of the highest rank to openly appear in explicitly erotic and provocative scenes, as in the scandalous film The Killing of Sister George, where her lesbian storyline shocked even a seasoned audience. Yet what unfolded on screen was only a pale reflection of her real-life adventures. Susanna changed lovers with unnerving precision, today a co-star, tomorrow a celebrated playwright, the day after an aristocrat lured by her glacial charm. She possessed the talent of a quiet predator. She never boasted about her affairs, but she never denied herself the pleasure of shattering someone else's ideal for the sake of fleeting desire. She was considered dangerous precisely because she did not look like a promiscuous woman. She looked like a devoted wife and mother of two, which allowed her to slip into the most closed circles and leave chaos in her wake. Her romances in the 70s often resembled psychological duels, where Susanna always struck first, leaving men dizzy from the collision of her outward coolness and the hidden fire she revealed only behind closed bedroom doors. Susanna York's promiscuity was a form of rebellion against the role of eternal ingenue imposed upon her. She despised her own sweetness and sought to desecrate it in the most radical ways possible. Her list of lovers during the decade included some of the most ambiguous figures of the British establishment. She did not seek fame, she had more than enough of it. She sought intensity, the kind only forbidden connections could provide. Susanna could conduct an affair openly in her husband's presence, pushing situations to the edge of absurdity, all while maintaining an expression of absolute innocence. The press whispered about her involvement with Terence Stamp and other idols of the era, but Susanna merely smiled enigmatically and continued her double game. For her, intimacy was a tool of control, a way to prove to herself that she commanded a world where men were accustomed to dominance. She was an intellectual courtesan, preferring conversations about Shakespeare before descending into more earthly pursuits, and this blend of intellect and lust drove her admirers to madness. In the 70s, she was everywhere, from the covers of intellectual magazines to the most dubious Soho parties, always an outsider and yet completely at home. By the end of the decade, Susanna York emerged as a woman who had carried her secret through the years without losing either the respect of her colleagues or the love of the public. Her promiscuity remained shrouded in a mist of implication which only heightened her allure. She proved that one could change lovers like gloves without becoming tabloid fodder, provided one possessed enough intelligence and grace. Susanna entered history as the Ice Maiden of British cinema, whose inner world burned with passions most people only dared to imagine. Her journey through the 70s was marked not by loud scandals, but by quiet catastrophes in the lives of men who made the mistake of falling in love with that golden whirlwind. She was and remains a great actress who turned her private life into the most intricate and compelling film of her career, one whose ending was always left unresolved. Susanna York showed the world that true promiscuity does not require publicity, it requires style, and in that art she had no equal in all Britain.
Julie Christie. If Susanna York was a master of secret intrigues, then in the 1970s, Julie Christie became the living embodiment of the ideals of swinging London, carried into a new, more cynical decade. Her face was called the face of the era, yet her soul belonged only to herself, and no man, no matter his talent or power, ever managed to tame that golden whirlwind. Christie was uninhibited not out of a hunger for scandal or money, but from a deep, almost religious conviction that monogamy was a prison for creativity. In the 70s, she did not simply change lovers, she lived in a state of permanent pursuit of new emotional stimuli, turning her private life into an endless series of brilliant flashes. The loudest, most exhausting, and most decadent episode of that time was her long, turbulent affair with Warren Beatty. It was a union of two of the most beautiful and most unfaithful people on the planet. While tabloids speculated endlessly about the wedding of the century, Julie and Warren created a private hell fueled by mutual infidelities, jealousy, and an absolute inability to stop. Christie changed partners right under the nose of Hollywood's greatest womanizer, proving that a British woman could be far more unpredictable and daring than any American playboy. She was not looking for stability, she was searching for a spark, and for that spark she was willing to burn down any commitment, leaving behind nothing but ashes and awed whispers in studio corridors. The 70s became a period of absolute sexual autonomy for Julie Christie.
She was one of the rare actresses who could dictate terms to the greatest directors while living a life that shocked even the most liberal critics. Her excess was light and natural, like breathing itself. She could fall into an affair with her co-star in Don't Look Now, Donald Sutherland, with such intensity that their on-screen intimacy is still considered one of the most realistic in cinema history. Rumors circulated that their sex on camera was not simulated, and Julie never hurried to deny them. She did not care about her reputation, only the moment mattered. She chose men not strategically, but instinctively. Today she might be drawn to an intellectual playwright, tomorrow to a rebellious musician, and the day after she could vanish from view with an unknown young man simply because the spotlight bored her. Christie possessed a frightening honesty. She never promised fidelity and never demanded it in return, which made her relationships both intoxicating and unbearable. She was solar chaos, a woman who brought light into the lives of her lovers, only for that light to blind and scorch them when she decided it was time to move on. Julie Christie's excess in the 70s was a form of intellectual rebellion. She was deeply involved in politics, openly opposing the system, and her personal life became part of that struggle for the right to exist on her own terms. She despised bourgeois values and the institution of marriage, seeing them as relics of the past. Her list of lovers during that decade read like a who's who of the global elite, yet none of those men could claim to possess Julie. She could live in communes, engage in fleeting affairs while traveling the world, then return to London to shine at premieres on the arm of a new favorite. She was labeled a circulating prize of British cinema, but in truth it was the men who were her trophies, brief chapters in her vast romance with life itself. In the 70s, Julie Christie was everywhere, from Hollywood to India, leaving behind a trail of broken hearts and shattered stereotypes about how a national treasure of Britain was supposed to behave. She proved that one could be a style icon and still live like the freest, most reckless woman in Soho without losing an ounce of magical allure. By the end of the decade, Julie Christie stood as a woman who had lost no battle with time or morality. Her excess became legend, only enhancing her stature as a great actress. She proved that loyalty to oneself matters far more than loyalty to a partner, and that a woman can change men like gloves while remaining deeply respected and adored by the public. Julie entered history as a symbol of elusive beauty, whose private life was as much a work of art as her roles. Her path through the 70s was marked not only by prestigious awards, but countless men who never managed to forget her. She was and remains a great rebel, a woman who understood that true freedom comes at a high price, yet was willing to pay any cost for the right to wake up in a new bed with a new feeling.
Vanessa Redgrave. If all the previous heroines of our chronicle changed men for glamour, money, or aesthetic pleasure, then Vanessa Redgrave in the 1970s turned promiscuity into a form of radical political protest. Tall, commanding, a British patrician with the face of an ancient goddess and a voice capable of sending battalions into battle, she was perhaps the most dangerous woman of the decade. For Vanessa, there was no line between the fight for the rights of the oppressed and the fight for the right to command her own body as she saw fit. In the 70s, her private life was not merely a string of scandalous headlines, it was an ideological bomb planted beneath the foundations of the British establishment. She changed like-minded lovers with the same ferocious intensity with which she marched against the Vietnam War or spoke out in support of Palestine. Redgrave dismissed monogamy as a bourgeois relic and fidelity to a single partner as a form of bondage imposed by the capitalist system. Her promiscuity was intellectual, militant, and entirely public. She did not hide in hotel shadows, she loved on the barricades, drawing into her orbit the brightest and most unhinged rebels of the era. She was too vast for any family, too loud for any home, and too free for any man who dared to impose rules upon her. The most vivid and destructive episode of her personal life in the 70s was her long affair with Italian actor Franco Nero. It was a union of ice and fire, British intellect and Mediterranean passion. Yet even Franco, the father of her son, could not confine Vanessa within the limits of a conventional relationship. She openly declared that her heart belonged to the revolution and her body to those who shared her ideals. Her roster of lovers during the decade included revolutionary activists, radical directors, and actor rebels who fell under her hypnotic influence. Vanessa changed men not on a whim, but at the command of her restless soul, which sought a spark in everything. Her relationship with Timothy Dalton, who was significantly younger, became another deliberate provocation to society. She led young, handsome men like knights into her cause and discarded them just as easily when a new political necessity or fresh passion appeared on the horizon. Redgrave possessed a terrifying sincerity. She never lied to her lovers about the fact that they were only fragments of her greater journey. She was a predator who hunted not for wallets, but for souls, and her promiscuity was the highest expression of her personal autonomy in a world that still demanded women remain obedient shadows of their husbands. For Vanessa Redgrave, the 70s were a decade of total contempt for reputation. While the British press branded her a mad Trotskyist and a national disgrace for her political views, Vanessa poured fuel to the fire with her personal freedom. She could deliver a fiery speech about Palestinian liberation one day and wake up the next morning beside a new favorite whose ideas were even more radical than the last. Her promiscuity became a form of networking. Through intimacy, she recruited people into her causes, turning desire into a tool of propaganda and solidarity. She saw nothing shameful in using her allure to achieve higher goals, and men willingly became victims of this revolutionary siren. In the 70s, she was everywhere, from Hollywood, where she accepted an Oscar amid boos, to refugee camps in the Middle East, always the same woman who changed partners as readily as political slogans. She proved that one could be the greatest actress of her generation while living a life that defied every moral code, without sacrificing aristocratic poise or magnetic power. By the end of the decade, Vanessa Redgrave stood as the most controversial figure in British society. Her promiscuity became an inseparable part of her myth, the myth of a woman who could not be bought, intimidated, or compelled to be faithful to anything except her ideals. She demonstrated that freedom is indivisible. One cannot be free in politics and a slave in the bedroom. Vanessa entered history as a woman who turned her private life into a permanent rally for the right to be herself. Her journey through the 70s was marked not only by monumental roles on screen, but by a wake of broken male destinies, men who tried to tame her and discovered they were merely temporary companions in her endless march towards justice. She was and remains the great Amazon of the British screen, fully aware that the right to change lovers like gloves comes at the price of public hatred, a price she paid with a victor's smile. Vanessa Redgrave showed the world that true passion knows no borders, and that in a world where everything is for sale, only the freedom of desire remains a genuine act of rebellion. Her story is the finale of our chronicle of Britain's 10 most promiscuous actresses, confirming that great women do not follow rules, they create their own, and in those rules there is no room for boredom, fidelity, or compromise.
Bringing this gripping and at times unsettling chronicle to a close, it becomes clear that for British actresses, the 1970s were not merely a period of creative exploration, but a true battlefield for the right to control their own destiny, their bodies, and their reputations. We have seen 10 radically different lives, yet all of these women were united by one thing, an absolute refusal to conform to the grey canons of public morality and a willingness to pay any price for independence. Elizabeth Taylor proved that a private life could be transformed into monumental art, where each new husband was simply another chapter in a grand saga of passion, while Vanessa Redgrave turned her romances into a political manifesto, burning bridges for the sake of revolutionary ideals. We watched Joan Collins build her empire on the ruins of male ego, wielding sexuality like a bulldozer, and Charlotte Rampling shock the world with intellectual depravity, proving that freedom recognizes no borders. These women changed lovers like gloves, not out of frivolity, but out of a hunger for authenticity in a world that demanded nothing from them but a beautiful image on screen. Some of them, like Jacqueline Bisset or Julie Christie, emerged from this marathon victorious, preserving their dignity and their status as icons. Others left pieces of their souls along the way, becoming casualties of a system that first glorified their excess and then mercilessly punished them for it. That era has passed, leaving behind a trail of broken hearts, empty bottles of expensive champagne, and legends that still make us freeze with a mix of awe and unease. Looking back at their paths today, we understand that their so-called sins were merely a form of honesty, and their endless Smena partners was an attempt to find that one person or that one feeling that could fill the void that arrives with global fame. They were the first to dare to live at full volume without glancing at censorship or whispers behind their backs, and that is precisely what made them eternal. In the end, their stories are not just a catalogue of affairs, but a chronicle of female power that finally broke free in the 1970s, forever changing the face of world cinema and our understanding of what it truly means to be a free woman.